The streets of Memphis had seen their fair share of heartbreak. But nothing like this. Nothing this brutal. Nothing this deliberate. She had made her choice. She had moved on, found love again, a new beginning, a future filled with promise. But for one man, that choice wasn't hers to make. In his mind, she still belonged to him. And if he couldn't have her, then no one else would. It was an ordinary evening. The sun had barely dipped below the skyline, the city still humming with life. On a quiet suburban road, two people walked hand in hand, their laughter echoing under the streetlights. They had no idea they were being watched. No idea that just a few blocks away, a pair of hands were tightening around a steering wheel, knuckles white, eyes locked onto them, waiting, watching, seething. And then, without warning, the roar of an engine shattered the silence. In a matter of seconds, headlights flooded the pavement. Tires screeched. Metal met flesh. A body was thrown into the air. Another crushed beneath the weight of a moving steel monster. The truck didn't slow down. It didn't stop. It tore through the night like a bullet, leaving behind a scene of devastation. And in the driver's seat sat a man who had made his decision long before this moment. A man consumed by the one thing more dangerous than hatred: obsession. Tonight he wasn't just taking a life. He was making a statement. And by the time the sirens came wailing, the city of Memphis would be left with one haunting question. How far will a man go when love turns to rage? This is the story of a choice that led to murder, a betrayal that cost 2 lives, and a crime so calculated, so vicious, that it left even the most hardened detectives questioning. Was this a moment of madness? Or had this been the plan all along? Stay with us as we unravel the truth behind the man who turned heartbreak into homicide. To understand how love turned into murder, we need to go back, to the beginning, before the crime scene, before the jealousy, before the obsession. Her name was Zara Mitchell, 26 years old, a nurse, dedicated to saving lives, with a quiet confidence that made people feel safe around her. She was the kind of woman who could walk into a room and leave an impression without trying. Her laughter was effortless, her kindness sincere. She had spent years putting others first, her patients, her family, her friends. And now, finally, she was putting herself first. She had been in a relationship for nearly 4 years, a relationship that on the surface seemed stable, but stability isn't the same as happiness. And Zara wasn't happy. The man she once loved had become a shadow of the person she fell for. Malcolm Ross, 32. A truck driver, well respected among his colleagues, hard-working, determined. But beneath the surface, there was something else. A need for control, a fear of being left behind. A man who saw love not as a partnership, but as possession. In the beginning, it was good. He was charming, protective, always there, always watching. At first, it felt like devotion, like commitment. But over time, it felt like something else, something suffocating. Zara tried to ignore the warning signs, the way he questioned her about where she was going, the way he grew quiet when she mentioned a male co-worker, the times he showed up unannounced at her job, claiming it was just a coincidence. She convinced herself it was love, but love wasn't supposed to feel like surveillance. Still, she stayed, until she met someone else. Someone who reminded her what it felt like to breathe again. Troy Carter, 30, a gym owner. Confident, easygoing, the kind of man who didn't just listen when she spoke, he actually heard her. Their connection was effortless. And in a matter of months, Zara realized what she had been denying for years. She was done with Malcolm. She was ready to move on. And so, one evening, she made a decision. A conversation that she knew would be painful, but necessary. She met Malcolm at their usual spot, a quiet diner on the edge of town. She looked him in the eyes and told him the words he had always feared hearing. I don't love you anymore. What happened next would change everything. That freedom came in the form of Troy Carter, a charismatic entrepreneur who made Zara feel seen in a way Malcolm never did. With Troy, conversation felt easy, laughter came naturally, and for the first time in years, Zara wasn't walking on eggshells. Their connection was undeniable. What started as casual turned into something real, something she wasn't willing to hide. And it didn't take long before she made a decision that would change everything. Zara didn't owe Malcolm an explanation. She didn't need his permission to move on. But Malcolm didn't see it that way. To him, love wasn't something that could be undone with a simple goodbye. And watching Zara build a new life without him, watching another man take the place he once held, was more than he could handle. It started with small things. Unanswered calls at odd hours. Texts that went from desperate to angry in the span of minutes. Then came the unexpected run-ins. A grocery store, the parking lot of her gym, even outside the hospital where she worked. Malcolm claimed it was all coincidence, but Zara knew better. She could feel it, that presence lingering just close enough to be noticed, just far enough to be denied. Her friends told her she was being paranoid. They said Malcolm was hurting, that he would move on. But Zara knew Malcolm. She knew his pride, his temper, the way he held grudges. He wasn't the type to let go easily. And the way he looked at her now, it wasn't just sadness. It was something else, something she couldn't quite name. Then, there were the warnings. The little signs she tried to push to the back of her mind. A slashed tire. A strange car parked outside her apartment for hours. A message from an unknown number that simply read, "You think he can protect you." She changed her locks, told herself it was all in her head, that Malcolm wouldn't really hurt her, that he wasn't capable of something like that. But the truth was, Malcolm wasn't just angry. He was planning. And while Zara tried to convince herself she was safe, Malcolm was already one step ahead. Late at night, he sat in front of his computer, scrolling through her social media, dissecting every post, every comment, every picture. A gala event, a dinner date. Zara smiling, with Troy Carter in the background, his hand resting on the small of her back. A pose that meant nothing to most, but to Malcolm, it was the final straw. It was no longer just about Zara leaving him. It was about humiliation. He had been replaced, discarded, and in his mind, there was only one way to take back control. Friends would later recall the shift in Malcolm's demeanor. He stopped showing up to work, barely spoke when they reached out. He wasn't grieving the end of a relationship. He was consumed by it. And as the days passed, his focus narrowed. His thoughts darkened. He started searching for answers in places no rational person would. His browser history painted a picture of a man unraveling. How to track someone's location without them knowing. Can deleted texts be recovered? How fast does a truck need to go to kill on impact? To Malcolm, these weren't just questions. They were preparation. By the time Zara realized just how much danger she was in, it was already too late. Zara was trying to move on, but Malcolm wasn't letting go. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her with Troy. Every time he picked up his phone, he fought the urge to call her, to remind her of who she used to be, who she was supposed to be, with him. But she didn't answer anymore. She was gone, out of his reach, and the thought of it gnawed at him like an open wound. At first, he convinced himself it was about closure, that if he could just see her, just be around her, he could find some way to make sense of it all. But it wasn't closure he wanted. It was control. And as the days passed, his actions became more deliberate, more calculated. It started small, driving past her apartment on his way home, slowing down just enough to glance up at her window. Harmless, just curiosity. But curiosity turned into routine. Routine turned into obsession. Night after night, he found himself parked on the same street, engine off, watching the lights in her apartment. Memorizing the times they flickered off, the moments she came and went. He wasn't just watching her. He was studying her. Zara noticed the feeling first, the nagging sense that she wasn't alone. Walking to her car, she'd glance over her shoulder, expecting to see someone, but there was never anyone there. Just an empty street. A quiet parking lot. Nothing out of the ordinary. But the feeling stayed with her. Then came the messages, random numbers, short cryptic text that made no sense but carried weight. I saw you today. You look different. Does he know who you really are? She blocked them, reported them, tried to brush them off. But the more she ignored them, the worse it got. One night, leaving work late, she stepped into the parking garage and saw something that made her stomach drop. Her car. Exactly where she had left it. But every tire had been slashed. All four. Nothing stolen. Nothing broken. Just disabled. Stranded. She called Troy, voice shaking, trying to keep calm. He told her to wait inside, that he'd come get her. But when she looked around, when she scanned the dimly lit rows of parked cars, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. Waiting. She told herself she was being paranoid, that maybe it was just some random act of vandalism, but deep down, she knew. Then there was the night she saw him, really saw him, sitting at a cafe with a friend, mid-conversation, laughing about something unimportant, until the air shifted. The feeling crept over her like a shadow, cold and heavy, and when she turned her head, there he was, sitting across the street, behind the wheel of his truck, watching, motionless, not even pretending to look away when their eyes met. Just there. She froze. Her breath caught in her throat. He didn't move, didn't flinch. He just sat there, staring, like he was waiting for something. Her friend followed her gaze, frowning. Zara? Is that him? She nodded, her pulse pounding. She felt her hands shake, her body screaming at her to move, to do something. Call the police, run, anything. But Malcolm was already ahead of her. As soon as she reached for her phone, the truck's engine growled to life, and then, just as slowly as he had appeared, he rolled forward, turning the corner and disappearing into the night. That was when she knew. This wasn't just grief. This wasn't just heartbreak. Malcolm wasn't letting go. But what Zara didn't realize, what no one realized, was that Malcolm had already decided how this was going to end. It was supposed to be a normal day. Zara had plans to attend a breast cancer charity walk at Shelby Farms Park. She was excited, happy, unaware that Malcolm had been watching her every move. The morning was clear, the air crisp with the first signs of autumn. Zara woke up early, took her time getting ready. She chose a soft pink hoodie, the color of the cause she was walking for. She sent a quick text to Troy. See you later? A simple message, filled with the kind of casual ease that comes with feeling safe. She had no idea she was being hunted. Malcolm had been awake for hours. He hadn't slept much in the last few weeks. Rest had been replaced with a gnawing fixation, a hunger that wouldn't go away. He had parked down the street from her apartment complex. Engine off, eyes locked on the front entrance. He already knew where she was going. He had known for days. He had watched her post about it, seen the excitement in her messages to friends. She was looking forward to today. She was moving forward, and that was something he couldn't allow. Zara left her apartment completely unaware of the dark vehicle sitting just out of sight, the man inside gripping the wheel so tightly his fingers ached. She got into her car, pulled out of the parking lot, and drove off toward the park. A few minutes later, Malcolm followed. Shelby Farms Park was already buzzing with activity by the time she arrived. Runners stretching, volunteers setting up tables, the air filled with chatter and laughter. A day of purpose, a day of hope. But in the distance, lurking at the edge of the parking lot, Malcolm sat watching. His truck blended in among the others, but his focus was razor sharp. He tracked every movement, every interaction, every moment she smiled at Troy, every glance they exchanged. It was fuel to the fire, burning inside him. Troy greeted Zara with a hug, slipping an arm around her waist as they made their way toward the starting line. Malcolm clenched his jaw so tightly he thought his teeth might crack. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She was his. She always had been. He had sacrificed for her, waited for her, loved her, and now she was giving it all away. To him. His grip tightened around the steering wheel. His breath was uneven, chest rising and falling with the weight of rage he could no longer contain. He wasn't thinking anymore. He wasn't planning. There was no more hesitation, no more second guessing. This was the moment she would understand, the moment he would make her understand. He put the truck in gear, pressing his foot against the accelerator just enough to inch forward, slow, patient, waiting for the right moment. Zara and Troy were walking toward their car, hand in hand, talking, laughing. She reached for her phone, probably to check a message. Troy said something that made her smile. She was glowing, alive, free. And that was the last thing Malcolm saw before he slammed his foot against the gas pedal. The roar of the engine cut through the hum of the crowd. Tires screeched against pavement. Heads turned. A second too late. Zara barely had time to register the sound before the truck was there. A wall of steel and speed barreling toward them with no hesitation, no remorse. It happened too fast for her to scream, too fast for Troy to react. Troy was hit first, the force lifting him off his feet and sending him crashing onto the hood before rolling onto the pavement. Zara had just enough time to see his body before the truck hit her next. The sound was sickening, bones breaking, flesh colliding with metal. She was thrown forward, skidding across the pavement before coming to a motionless stop. The truck didn't slow down. It kept going, swerving past stunned bystanders, tires screeching as Malcolm turned onto the main road. By the time the first screams pierced the air, by the time people rushed toward the broken bodies lying in the street, Malcolm was already gone. What happened next would leave the city of Memphis in shock. The scene was chaos. Screams rang out, people frozen in shock before instinct took over, rushing toward the motionless bodies sprawled across the pavement. A woman dialed 911 with trembling hands. A man kneeled beside Troy, pressing his fingers to the side of his neck, searching desperately for a pulse. Others turned their attention to Zara, who lay feet away, her body twisted unnaturally, her pink hoodie stained dark with blood. The charity walk had turned into something unrecognizable, something horrific. But Malcolm wasn't there to see it. He was already gone. He didn't stop to check if they were alive. He didn't hesitate or second guess. He had done what he came to do. As the city of Memphis reeled from the carnage he left behind, Malcolm Ross was speeding down the highway, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His heart pounded. His breaths came in short, ragged bursts, but his hands, they were steady. No regret, no fear. He had made his decision long before he pressed his foot against the gas pedal. He had played this moment over in his mind too many times for it to feel real. He had pictured Zara's face the moment she realized, had imagined the fear in her eyes, the way her body would crumble under the weight of impact. And now, it wasn't a thought anymore. It had happened. It was done. But Malcolm wasn't finished. He had a plan, or so he thought. He had known the escape routes, studied them in advance. He had thought about the timeline, the response time of law enforcement, the roads with the least traffic. He convinced himself he was ahead of it all. But in his mind, there was one thing he hadn't accounted for: how quickly everything would fall apart. The first mistake? The witnesses. There were too many of them. Dozens of people who had seen his face, who had watched him press down on that accelerator with clear intent. Strangers with phones already snapping pictures of his truck, recording license plates, descriptions, details. Before he had even cleared the edge of the park, his name was already being whispered among the growing crowd. The second mistake? The cameras. Shelby Farms Park was no isolated back road. It was a public space, lined with security cameras, street surveillance, and traffic light monitors. From the moment he entered that parking lot to the moment he fled, his movements were being tracked. There was no question of who had done this, only where he was now. And the third mistake? He had underestimated just how fast the city would move to hunt him down. Law enforcement was already closing in. Police dispatchers relayed descriptions of the vehicle, its last known direction. Patrol cars fanned out across the city, scanning roads and intersections, waiting for the moment he slipped up. Malcolm thought he had time. He thought he could put distance between himself and the crime. But time was running out. He tore through Memphis, weaving between cars, his mind racing through options. Where could he go? Who could he call? He couldn't go home. It would be the first place they checked. He couldn't call anyone. His phone could be traced. Every scenario, every alternative, led to the same conclusion. There was no escape. And then, the moment he had been dreading. The flashing red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror, the sound of sirens closing in. He was out of time. His hands clenched the wheel, his pulse hammering in his ears. His mind screamed at him to keep going, to find a way out. But deep down, he knew. There was no way out. He had made sure of that the moment he pressed his foot against the gas pedal. The police were closing in. With CCTV footage, witness statements, and forensic evidence, Malcolm had nowhere to run. The call had gone out across the city within minutes of the attack. Officers were stationed at key intersections, scanning for the vehicle described by witnesses. A dark-colored truck with front-end damage, last seen speeding away from Shelby Farms Park. The roads leading out of Memphis were being watched. State troopers had been notified. Helicopters were preparing to take flight. There was no way he could disappear. Not now, not with so many eyes searching for him. Malcolm knew it too. His grip on the wheel tightened as he stared at the road ahead, his mind racing through options that no longer existed. Every direction led to the same outcome. Every turn brought him closer to the inevitable. And then, the flashing lights, the sirens, the patrol cars gaining on him from behind. Dispatch had called it in. Suspect is in pursuit, heading east on I-40. The officers on his tail weren't taking chances. He had already proven what he was capable of. Now the priority was making sure no one else got hurt. Malcolm pressed harder on the gas, the truck lurching forward as he weaved between cars, pushing speeds that made the vehicle shake. But it didn't matter. The police were trained for this. They were waiting for him to slip up, to make one wrong move. And it didn't take long. Ahead, a roadblock was forming. Patrol cars spread across the highway, cutting off any escape. Officers stood ready, weapons drawn, prepared for whatever happened next. Malcolm had nowhere left to go. For the first time, panic crept into his chest. His breaths came in short bursts, his mind scrambling for another way out. But there was no way out, not anymore. And as the reality set in, a different thought took hold. If this was how it ended, maybe it wouldn't be the police who got the final say. Maybe he could take control one last time. His right hand left the wheel, reaching toward the glove compartment. He knew what was inside. The cold steel. The final choice. If he couldn't escape, then maybe he wouldn't let them take him alive. But the officers weren't giving him that chance. The police cruiser behind him accelerated, closing the gap. In a coordinated move, officers executed a precision immobilization technique, striking his truck at an angle. The vehicle spun violently, tires screeching against pavement, before crashing to a stop along the median. The doors of the patrol cars flew open. Officers rushed forward, weapons aimed, shouting commands. "Hands up! Get out of the vehicle!" But Malcolm didn't move. He was gripping the gun now, his fingers curled around the trigger. His chest heaved as he stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror, at the man he had become, at the life he had destroyed. For a moment, the world outside faded. The voices, the sirens, the flashing lights, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was whether or not he was ready to pull the trigger. Seconds stretched into eternity. And then, finally, his hands loosened. The gun fell to the seat beside him. Slowly, he reached for the door handle. His body was shaking as he stepped out, his hands lifting into the air. It was over. Officers moved in swiftly, securing him in handcuffs, pressing him against the hood of a police car. The man who had once claimed to love Zara Mitchell, the man who had chased her, stalked her, hunted her, was now nothing more than a prisoner in the back of a squad car. The evidence was overwhelming. Witness testimony, surveillance footage, the vehicle damage. And then there was everything else. The threatening messages, the slashed tires, the internet searches that painted a picture of premeditation. Malcolm had spent weeks plotting his revenge, and now he would spend the rest of his life paying for it. The trial was swift. The prosecution laid out every chilling detail, piece by piece. The jury listened to the voicemail messages, read through the text threats. They saw the photos, the footage, the path of destruction he had left behind. And when the verdict was read, there was no hesitation. Guilty. First-degree murder. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Malcolm Ross would never walk free again. Justice was served, but at what cost? A life lost to obsession and control. A reminder that sometimes the greatest danger comes from those who claim to love us the most. Zara Mitchell had her whole life ahead of her. A woman who dedicated herself to healing others, whose kindness and ambition should have carried her forward. But instead, she became a target. A victim of the one thing she could never have predicted. The possessiveness of a man who refused to let her go. Malcolm Ross thought love was ownership. That if he couldn't have her, no one else could. That he had the right to take her choices, her happiness, her future. But love doesn't work that way. Love isn't control. Love isn't fear. And love is never supposed to end in bloodshed. What happened to Zara is not just a tragedy. It's a warning. A story about the cost of ignoring the signs. About what happens when obsession festers unchecked. How many times had she looked over her shoulder, feeling his presence before she saw him? How many times had she dismissed the uneasy feeling in her gut, convincing herself that he would move on? That the threats were just words. That the jealousy was harmless. But it wasn't harmless, and Malcolm wasn't letting go. Her death was not an accident. It was not a moment of passion. It was a calculated, deliberate act. One man's final attempt at control. And now, he will spend the rest of his life behind bars, stripped of the very freedom he tried to take from her. But that doesn't bring her back. It doesn't erase the fear she felt in those final moments. It doesn't undo the years of control, of stalking, of emotional manipulation that led to that one violent act. Zara's story is one of thousands. A chilling reminder that leaving isn't always enough. That some people see rejection as a challenge. That some obsessions don't fade, they escalate. And sometimes the person you fear the most is the one who once swore they'd never hurt you. If you or someone you know is in a controlling or abusive relationship, know that you are not alone. There are resources. There is help. And most importantly, there is a way out before it's too late. If you found this story gripping, Subscribe for more real-life true crime stories that will leave you speechless. Stay safe. And remember, love should never be deadly.